November 1944. The Hürtgen Forest. Rain, ceaseless and cold, turned the shattered earth into a primeval mire of mud, splintered pine, and death. For Grenadier Klaus Richter, a boy of 19 who had been old for years, the world had shrunk to the few miserable meters of his waterlogged foxhole. His universe was the rhythmic sucking sound of the mud, the distant, indifferent crump of artillery, and the gnawing, hollow ache in his gut. For 3 days, his only sustenance had been a third of a loaf of Times, Kommissbrot *, the Wehrmacht's infamous rye bread. It was a dense, dark brick, already stale when issued, now hard as wood from the damp cold. Chewing it was an act of sheer will, a laborious grinding of gritty, sawdust-like crumbs that offered little energy and even less comfort. It was the taste of a dying empire, the taste of scarcity, the taste of defeat. He and his squadmates, huddled for warmth and the illusion of safety, had stopped talking about home, about girls, about anything beyond the next artillery barrage or the next meagre distribution of rations. Hope was a resource more scarce than ammunition. It was during a brief, terrifying skirmish over a meaningless stretch of trail that Richter stumbled upon the body. An American. Young, like him, his face pale and peaceful in the grey gloom. His uniform, though torn and muddy, was of a quality that Richter found himself staring at. The wool was thick, the boots sturdy, but it wasn't the uniform that held his gaze. Lying next to the soldier's outstretched hand was a small rectangular box made of waxed cardboard. It was innocuous, a strange, clean object in a world of filth. Richter had heard rumours from veterans of the Normandy campaign, whispers of the incredible supplies the Americans possessed, but he had dismissed them as battlefield fables. Now, with trembling fingers, he picked up the box. It was surprisingly heavy. On the front, in simple block letters, were the words, Ration, Type K, Breakfast Unit. He scurried back to his foxhole, clutching the box to his chest like a holy relic. His squadmates watched him, their eyes wide and hungry. This was something alien, a package from a world they couldn't comprehend. The German High Command had assured them the American soldier was soft, a product of a decadent, materialistic society, lacking the Spartan warrior spirit of the Reich. They were told American industry was a fragile house of cards, incapable of sustaining a long war. Yet, here was this object, a single soldier's breakfast, packaged with a level of care and expense that a German general might not see. With the tip of his trench knife, Klaus carefully broke the wax seal. The men leaned in, their breathing shallow. They never expected what they were about to see. What lay inside would not just fill their stomachs, it would shatter their souls. Inside, nestled in neat compartments, was a treasure trove that seemed to mock their entire existence. A small can of processed meat with pork and egg yolk, 4 biscuits, perfectly formed and sealed in cellophane, a compressed cereal bar, a packet of sugar, a packet of Nescafé instant coffee, a fruit bar, and then, the final, killing blows to their morale, a pack of 4 Chesterfield cigarettes and a flat 2-ounce bar of Hershey's sweet milk chocolate. The men were stunned into silence. They simply stared, their minds unable to process the sheer, casual abundance contained in a single soldier's breakfast. The German ration system was built on the principle of grim necessity. A soldier received what he needed to fight and die, nothing more. A typical day's ration consisted of the hardtack bread, a small portion of sausage or tinned meat, some cheese if they were lucky, and ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns and chicory. It was fuel, joyless and bleak, the idea of a personal, disposable package for each meal, containing not just sustenance but luxuries, was so foreign it felt like science fiction. They were utterly shocked. They had been told they were the masters of Europe, the inheritors of a 1,000-year Reich. Yet they were fighting and starving on stale bread while the enemy, they were told, was inferior, ate like kings. Klaus picked up the Hershey's bar. Chocolate was a ghost from another lifetime, a memory from childhood Christmases before the war. He broke off a small piece and placed it on his tongue. The rich, sweet flavour that melted across his palate was so intense, so overwhelming, that an involuntary sob escaped his throat. He looked at his comrades. One of them, a hardened veteran of the Eastern Front named Corporal Schmidt, a man who hadn't shown emotion since Stalingrad, was openly weeping, Tears streamed down his grimy face, carving clean paths through the dirt. They weren't tears of joy. They were tears of despair. They wept for the lie they had been living. They wept for their hunger, for their misery, for the stark, undeniable proof in their hands that they were going to lose. Each item in that box was a weapon more powerful than a tank shell. The cigarettes were a testament to an economy that could spare tobacco for its frontline soldiers. The cellophane-wrapped biscuits spoke of a manufacturing base that hadn't been bombed into the Stone Age. The instant coffee, a marvel of food science, represented a technological and industrial sophistication they couldn't possibly match. And the chocolate was the cruelest blow of all. It was a symbol of a nation so rich, so powerful, that it could afford to give its soldiers a taste of home, a moment of simple, human pleasure, in the middle of a war zone. The German soldiers couldn't believe it. This single K-ration was an ambassador from a different reality, a reality of overwhelming material superiority. The propaganda they had been fed for years, the speeches of the Führer promising victory through sheer will and sacrifice, all of it crumbled into dust in the face of a 2-ounce bar of chocolate. How could they win against an enemy that considered this level of supply to be normal, to be disposable? This scene, repeated in countless foxholes and trenches across Western Europe, was the quiet, unwritten story of Germany's defeat. It was a defeat that began not with the roar of cannons, but with the crinkle of a cellophane wrapper. The story of the K-Ration is the story of how America didn't just outfight the Third Reich. It buried it under an avalanche of material. To understand the shock, one must first understand the world of the German Lanzer. His entire existence was governed by the concept of time's Ersatz asterisk, or substitute. From the moment the war began, the German war economy was a fragile, carefully managed system stretched to its breaking point. The Allied naval blockade slowly starved the nation of essential resources. The Allied bombing campaign, which began as a trickle and grew into a torrent, systematically dismantled German industry, transportation, and agriculture. The German quartermaster was a master of improvisation, tasked with feeding an army of millions with dwindling supplies. Bread was baked with increasing amounts of potato flour and even sawdust to stretch the grain. Coffee was replaced with roasted barley. Butter was a distant memory, replaced by margarine. Meat was a rarity, often horse meat or whatever could be foraged from the occupied territories. This scarcity bred a culture of grim acceptance. The German soldier was taught to embrace hardship as a virtue. It was a sign of his toughness, his ideological purity. He was a Spartan, and the enemy was a decadent Athenian, soft and spoiled. This belief was a critical pillar of Nazi propaganda, essential for maintaining morale in the face of mounting losses and deprivation. The American G.I., in their propaganda, was portrayed as a coward, unwilling to fight, a product of a weak, mixed-race society who would crumble at the first sign of real hardship. They were shopkeepers and jazz musicians, not warriors. German soldiers went into battle, expecting to face an enemy that was materially equipped but spiritually weak. They never knew the truth until they saw it for themselves. The American logistical operation that landed in Europe in 1944 was, without exaggeration, the greatest industrial miracle in the history of warfare. It was a system so vast, so efficient, and so overwhelmingly powerful that the German High Command, even with their own vaunted reputation for efficiency, simply couldn't comprehend it. They were completely surprised by its scale. The K-Ration was just the tip of a colossal iceberg of supply. It had been designed by a physiologist named Ancel Keys in 1941, who was tasked with creating a non-perishable, nutritionally balanced, pocket-sized meal for airborne troops. The result was a masterpiece of food science and packaging. 3 distinct boxes, breakfast, dinner, and supper, each providing around 1,200 calories. The contents were a marvel of American industrial food production: processed cheese from Kraft, canned meats from Hormel, biscuits from Nabisco, chewing gum from Wrigley's, hard candy from Charms, and chocolate from Hershey's. Even the small details were astounding. Each meal unit contained a P38 can opener, a wooden spoon, and a small supply of toilet paper. What stunned the Germans wasn't just the quality, but the sheer, mind-numbing quantity. Between 1,942 and 1,945, American factories produced over 105 million K-rations. This was in addition to the billions of other types of rations, like the C-ration and the 1-0-in-1 group ration. The American soldier was the best-fed fighting man in the world, and it wasn't even close. While German soldiers were being issued iron rations that were meant to last for days, the American G.I. often treated his K-rations as disposable snacks, frequently trading away the items he didn't like. Stories abounded of GIs giving chocolate bars to local children or trading cigarettes for fresh eggs. To the hungry Germans, this was an act of casual profligacy that bordered on madness. They couldn't believe the carelessness with which the Americans treated such luxuries. The logistical chain that delivered these rations was even more incredible. It was called the Red Ball Express, a massive, non-stop truck convoy system that, at its peak, involved nearly 6,000 trucks delivering over 12,500 tons of supplies to the front lines every single day. The vast majority of the drivers were African-American soldiers, working around the clock to keep the Allied armies fueled, armed, and fed. The Germans had nothing that could even remotely compare. Their supply lines were dependent on railways that were being constantly bombed by Allied aircraft. Their trucks were a motley collection of captured vehicles from a dozen different countries, constantly breaking down for lack of spare parts. The German soldier was often forced to rely on horse-drawn carts, an image straight from the First World War, while the Americans roared past in an endless river of GMC trucks. This contrast was not lost on the German troops. They could see the evidence of American power with their own eyes. They saw the fields littered with discarded American equipment. AGI might ditch a perfectly good raincoat or blanket simply because he didn't want to carry it, knowing a replacement would be readily available. For a German soldier whose own coat was threadbare and whose boots were worn through, this was a demoralizing spectacle. They were shocked by the American culture of disposability, a direct product of a nation that could produce more than it could possibly consume. It was a form of psychological warfare more effective than any leaflet drop. Every empty can of Spam, every discarded cigarette butt, every K-ration box lying in the mud was a message: "We have more of everything than you. You cannot win." The psychological impact deepened in the prisoner of war camps. German soldiers, captured and expecting harsh treatment, were instead confronted with a level of care they never expected. They were deloused, given clean clothes, and then taken to a mess hall where they were served hot meals with white bread, real butter, and unlimited coffee with sugar and milk. For many, it was the first decent meal they had eaten in years. Interrogation reports from Allied intelligence are filled with the stunned reactions of German POWs. One captured officer, after being served a standard American meal, demanded to know if this was a special meal for propaganda purposes. When he was told that all American soldiers ate this way 3 times a day, he fell silent and refused to speak for an hour. He later admitted that this realization, more than any battlefield defeat, convinced him that the war was utterly hopeless. The Germans had been told that they were fighting for their very survival against barbarian hordes from the east and decadent capitalists from the west. But in the POW camps, they were shown American movies. They listened to American jazz and swing music on the radio. They saw newsreels of American cities, with their towering skyscrapers and streets filled with automobiles. They were confronted with the undeniable truth that the nation they were fighting was not decadent or weak, but was in fact a vibrant, powerful, and unbelievably wealthy civilization. They never knew a country could be so rich. This soft power offensive was a deliberate strategy. The American military understood that breaking the enemy's will to fight was just as important as destroying his armies. Every act of kindness, every display of abundance, was calculated to undermine the Nazi ideology that had driven the German soldier to fight with such fanaticism. The K-ration became the ultimate symbol of this strategy. It was more than just food. It was a promise. It was a tangible piece of the American way of life, delivered directly into the hands of the enemy. It represented a system that valued the individual soldier, that believed he deserved not just to survive, but to have a measure of comfort, a small luxury to remind him of the world he was fighting for. The German system, in stark contrast, viewed the individual soldier as utterly expendable, a mere cog in the war machine, to be fueled by stale bread and ideological fervor until he broke. This fundamental difference in philosophy was at the heart of the conflict. One side was fighting for an abstract, hateful ideology of conquest and racial purity. The other was fighting for a world of Hershey bars, Chesterfield cigarettes, and endless possibility. The German soldiers, who initially laughed at the idea of the pampered American G.I., were not laughing by the winter of 1944. They were starving, freezing, and surrounded by the ghosts of their fallen comrades. And in the quiet moments between battles, they dreamed. They dreamed of food, they dreamed of warmth, and they dreamed of the strange, waxed cardboard boxes that contained a taste of a world they had been taught to hate, but now secretly, desperately, yearned for. The ultimate irony was that the American industrial machine, the very thing Nazi propaganda had derided as a sign of soulless materialism, was powered by the spirit of the individual. The women who built the bombers, the men who drove the trucks, the workers who packed the K-Rations, they were not slaves of the state. They were free citizens, motivated by patriotism, a sense of duty, and the promise of a better life. They were the ones who truly built the arsenal of democracy. By the time the Battle of the Bulge erupted in December 1944, the Wehrmacht was a hollow shell. They managed to scrape together enough fuel and equipment for one last, desperate offensive, but their soldiers were malnourished and exhausted. They overran American positions, and were stunned to find warehouses packed to the ceiling with food, ammunition, and winter clothing. They gorged themselves on American rations, a fleeting moment of relief before the inevitable Allied counterattack. The offensive failed not only because of Allied air power and stubborn resistance, but because the German logistical tail was virtually non-existent. They simply ran out of everything. They had gambled on a short, sharp victory, because they were incapable of sustaining anything else. The Americans, on the other hand, had a logistical system that was deep, resilient, and seemingly infinite. When the 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne, they were resupplied by air, with C-47 seconds dropping thousands of tons of supplies, including full holiday turkey dinners for Christmas. The German soldiers besieging them were surviving on melted snow and captured American rations. The contrast could not have been more stark or more decisive. The war in Europe did not end in a grand, climactic battle of tactical genius. It ended in a slow, grinding process of annihilation. It was the victory of the factory over the general staff, the victory of the production line over the battle plan. The German soldier was a brave and formidable opponent, a product of a military tradition that had dominated Europe for centuries. But he was ultimately defeated by an enemy he couldn't see and couldn't understand. The American farmer, the American factory worker, and the American logistician. The true heroes of the war were not just the men who pulled the triggers, but the men and women who packed the rations, who welded the ships, and who drove the trucks. They were the architects of a victory so total, so overwhelming, that it redrew the map of the world. In the final, chaotic days of the war, as Allied armies poured into the heart of Germany, they were met by a civilian population on the brink of starvation. And once again, it was the American G.I. and his rations who became the face of the new reality. Soldiers shared their food with hungry German children, handing out chocolate bars and chewing gum. It was an act of simple humanity, but it was also the final, definitive act of conquest. It was the conquest of hearts and minds, achieved not with bullets, but with calories. It was the first step in transforming a bitter enemy into a future ally. The story of the K-Ration is a reminder that wars are not won by ideology or willpower alone. They are won by logistics. They are won by industry. They are won by the nation that can best organize its resources to project power across vast distances. And in the 20th century, no nation on earth could do that better than the United States of America. Decades later, survivors of the war from both sides would meet at reunions. They would share stories and old photographs, and the Germans would often speak, with a kind of lingering awe, about the first time they saw a K-Ration. They would remember the shock, the disbelief, and the slow, sinking realization that their cause was doomed. They had been prepared to fight and die for their fatherland. They were never prepared for an enemy who could weaponize chocolate. That small, waxed cardboard box, a footnote in the grand histories of the war, was in many ways the conflict's most potent symbol. It was a testament to a new kind of power, a power based not on ancient traditions of martial glory, but on the relentless, unstoppable engine of American industry. The Third Reich, with its dark dreams of a 1,000-year empire, was ultimately no match for a republic that could promise every one of its soldiers a hot cup of coffee, a cigarette, and a sweet taste of home. The laughter of the early war years had long since died. In its place was the quiet rustle of a ration wrapper, the sound of a world being irrevocably changed. The foundation of this overwhelming material power was a philosophy so fundamentally different from the Prussian military tradition that the German General Staff was psychologically incapable of grasping its significance until it was far too late. The German war machine was built on a centuries-old tradition of austere professionalism, discipline, and the belief that the individual existed to serve the state. Hardship was not something to be mitigated. It was an essential tool for forging a soldier's spirit. A Lanza was expected to endure, to sacrifice, to find strength in deprivation. To the German High Command, concepts like morale were linked to ideological fanaticism, belief in the Führer, and the glory of a victorious battle. The idea that a soldier's fighting spirit could be directly tied to the quality of his food, the comfort of his boots, or whether he had a cigarette after a meal was seen as a sign of weakness, a decadent, materialistic concern. They simply never knew that comfort could be a weapon. The American military, by contrast, was a direct reflection of its civilian society. It was a citizen army, drawn from a consumer culture that had, for decades, been perfecting the art of mass production and marketing. American industry didn't just build things, it built things with the end user in mind. The same companies that had spent the 1,930 seconds competing to produce the most comfortable car, the tastiest breakfast cereal, or the most satisfying soft drink were the ones that retooled for war. This consumer-centric mindset was never erased, it was simply militarized. The Quartermaster Corps approached the problem of supplying the GI-1, not just as a matter of delivering calories and bullets, but as a challenge of delivering a slice of home to the front lines. They understood, on a deeply cultural level, that a well-supplied soldier was not a soft soldier, but a more effective one. They knew that small comforts could act as a powerful psychological buffer against the horrors of combat. This philosophy manifested in ways that went far beyond the K-Ration, creating a world of logistical support that left captured Germans utterly stunned. Chief among these was the PX, or Post Exchange. The concept of a mobile retail store operating just miles behind the front lines was so alien to the German experience of total war that it sounded like a fantasy. Yet, for the American G.I., the PX was a lifeline. These humble depots, often set up in commandeered buildings or large tents, sold items that were pure, unobtainable luxury to their German counterparts. Coca-Cola, shipped by the literal boatload from the United States, Lifebuoy soap, Gillette razor blades, Squib shaving cream, and Kleenex tissues. The shelves were stocked with magazines like Times, Life, Asterisk, the Saturday Evening Post Asterisk, and the Soldier's Own publications, Asterisk, Yank Times, and Times Stars and Stripes Asterisk, filled with news from home, baseball scores, and pin-up photos of Hollywood starlets. For a German soldier whose only reading material was a tattered copy of Times' Mein Kampf Times or grim propaganda leaflets, the discovery of a discarded American magazine was a window into another universe. He was shocked to see a world of color advertisements, of smiling people driving new cars, of articles about movie premieres and sporting events. It was a portrait of a nation not just unaffected by the war, but seemingly thriving because of it. This was a nation that could fight a global conflict without even asking its citizens to give up their creature comforts. The German soldier couldn't believe it. His own family back home was living on meager rations, huddled in bomb shelters, their world shrinking every day. The American magazine in his hands told him that his sacrifice was meaningless, that he was fighting a nation whose casual, everyday life was more prosperous than his wildest peacetime dreams. Then there was the mail. The American military's V-mail system was another logistical miracle. Letters written on standardized forms were photographed, shipped as reels of microfilm across the Atlantic, and then reprinted and delivered to soldiers on the front, often within a week or two. At its peak, the system processed over 1 billion letters. For the GI, this constant connection to home was a vital pillar of his morale. For the German soldier, mail from home was a slow, uncertain affair, often taking months to arrive, if it arrived at all. His letters were heavily censored and often brought news of bombing raids and growing desperation. The American G.I. received letters filled with local gossip and love. The German Lanza received letters filled with fear and despair. This constant reinforcement of what they were fighting times for times gave the Americans a psychological resilience that the Germans, fighting for an increasingly abstract and failing ideology, could not match. But perhaps the most profound shock for the German soldier came if he was wounded and captured. The German medical service, while professional, was stretched to its absolute limit. A serious wound on the Eastern Front was often a death sentence. Supplies of anesthetics, bandages, and basic drugs were critically low. The American medical system, however, was a revelation. It was a fully realized, industrial-scale operation designed for one purpose: saving lives. German prisoners were taken to American field hospitals and couldn't believe what they saw. These facilities, often vast tent cities, were clean, well-lit, and staffed by an army of doctors and nurses. They had mobile X-ray machines, fully equipped operating theaters, and vast supplies of blood plasma. And they had penicillin. The Germans had heard rumors of this new wonder drug, but few had ever seen it. To them, an infection from shrapnel was a deadly threat. They watched in disbelief as American medics administered penicillin shots that could halt infections in their tracks, saving limbs and lives with what seemed like magical ease. What truly broke their minds, however, was that they received the exact same level of care as the American soldiers. Wounded German POWs were given blood plasma, life-saving surgery, and precious penicillin without a moment's hesitation. This act of humanitarianism was also a devastatingly effective act of psychological warfare. The Nazi regime had built its entire worldview on the concept of the times Untermensch asterisk, the subhuman enemy who deserved no mercy. Yet here were the Americans, treating their captured enemies with a level of medical care that their own army could not provide to its greatest heroes. It was an act of generosity so profound that it shattered the foundations of their ideology. They never expected to be treated as human beings. In the debriefing of one captured German staff doctor, he confessed that his 2 weeks in an American field hospital did more to convince him of Germany's defeat than 2 years on the Eastern Front. He said, "Your soldiers see a wounded man. We were taught to see a wounded enemy. I now understand that you are not fighting a war against us. You are fighting a war against death itself. How can anyone win against such an opponent?" This philosophy of overwhelming care extended to every piece of equipment the GI was issued. His M1 rifle was a masterpiece of mass production, a rugged and reliable semi-automatic weapon that gave him a significant firepower advantage over the bolt-action Kar-98K used by most German soldiers. But it was the soldier's personal gear that told the deeper story. He was issued multiple pairs of thick wool socks, with explicit orders to change them daily to prevent trench foot. His uniform was multi-layered for the cold, and his M1943 field jacket was a versatile, well-designed piece of equipment. He carried a personal first aid kit on his belt, complete with sulfur powder to disinfect wounds. Even his helmet was a marvel of practical design. The steel outer shell provided protection, while the inner liner could be removed and used as a wash basin or a cooking pot. Each of these items represented a link in a long, unbreakable chain of industrial production and thoughtful design. They were the products of a system that had decided, as a matter of national policy, that its soldiers were its most valuable resource, and that no expense would be spared in keeping them safe, healthy, and effective. The German soldier, issued ill-fitting boots and a single, often threadbare, greatcoat, could only look on with a mixture of envy and despair. His equipment was designed for a short, victorious war. The Americans' gear was designed to endure. It was the uniform of a nation that had come to Europe to stay until the job was done, no matter how long it took. This relentless onslaught of American material culture slowly and surely eroded the will of the German army. It was a war of attrition fought not just with bullets, but with biscuits, not just with tanks, but with toilet paper. German intelligence officers, receiving reports from the front about the state of American supplies, often refused to believe them. They assumed the reports were exaggerated or Allied propaganda. They laughed at the notion of an army that supplied its men with ice cream-making machines just miles from the front. But a few astute commanders began to understand. They saw the endless columns of trucks, the skies filled with American planes, the prisoners who were healthier than their own guards. They saw the K-Ration boxes littering every captured position. And they knew they were not fighting an army. They were fighting a force of nature, an unstoppable tide of production that was washing over their world and erasing it from existence. In the end, the German soldier was not defeated by a superior warrior. He was defeated by a superior system, a system that could build 10 Sherman tanks for every Tiger, that could train 5 pilots for every one of Germany's dwindling aces, and that believed a simple bar of chocolate was as vital to victory as a bomb. The final chapter of the war was written in the language of logistics. The American G.I, the boy from Ohio or Texas, was the final product of that system. He was the man who had everything, and because he had everything, he could endure anything. The war ended, and the G.I went home, back to a country untouched by bombs, ready to build an even more prosperous future. The German soldier returned to a nation in ruins, a landscape of rubble and ashes, haunted by the memory of a war that was lost not on the battlefield, but in the heart of a small, waxed cardboard box. Behind this tidal wave of material was an even more profound difference that the German mind, steeped in a tradition of state-controlled everything, struggled to comprehend: the nature of the American home front. The Nazi propaganda machine, under Joseph Goebbels, had declared total war in 1943. For the German citizen, this meant the complete subjugation of individual life to the needs of the state. Civilian factories were stripped of labor, which was rerouted to armaments production. Food, clothing, and fuel were ruthlessly rationed. Women were conscripted into factory work, and the entire economy was supplemented by the brutal exploitation of slave labor from conquered nations. The message to the German soldier was clear: the entire nation suffers with you, sacrifices with you, and places all its hopes in your hands. This created a powerful, if grim, sense of shared purpose. They were a nation of martyrs, holding back the tide. The German soldier was therefore shocked to his core when he began to understand the reality of the American home front. He expected that his enemy, the American G.I, was backed by a similarly strained and suffering populace. He couldn't have been more wrong. The United States did not just mobilize for war, it experienced an economic boom of unprecedented scale. The Great Depression, which had crippled the nation for a decade, vanished overnight. Factories that had been dormant for years roared back to life, running 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. But this was not a mobilization based on grim sacrifice alone. It was a mobilization powered by prosperity. While German civilians were eating turnips and bread made with extenders, American civilians were enjoying a higher standard of living than ever before. Wages soared. The government encouraged the purchase of war bonds not just as a patriotic duty, but as a savvy investment for a bright post-war future. Hollywood produced a torrent of optimistic, star-studded films. Big band music played on the radio. While German cities were being systematically reduced to rubble by Allied bombers, the lights of American cities burned brightly. The German soldier, upon learning this, was forced to confront a soul-crushing truth. This was not a total war for America. It was a war of total, effortless production. It was a war they were fighting with one hand tied behind their back, while the other hand was busy building a new consumer paradise. They never knew a nation could go to war and get richer in the process. This productive power wasn't a miracle. It was the result of a uniquely American system that Nazi ideology fundamentally misunderstood. German industry was a rigid, top-down structure, effective in producing high-quality, complex weapons like the Tiger tank, but slow and inefficient. They valued craftsmanship over sheer volume. The American system was the complete opposite. It was a chaotic, competitive, and decentralized ecosystem of innovation that valued speed, volume, and simplicity. The story of American war production is filled with moments that German central planners would have found baffling. When the U.S. Navy needed a way to land troops on hostile beaches, it wasn't a government committee that solved the problem. It was Andrew Higgins, a Louisiana boat builder who designed and mass-produced the LCVP, or Higgins boat, a simple, flat-bottomed plywood craft that became the key to the D-Day landings. His private company built over 20,000 of them. The iconic American Jeep wasn't designed by a team of military engineers. It was the product of a competition between small auto manufacturers, resulting in a vehicle so versatile, so rugged, and so beloved that it became the very symbol of American ingenuity. They were produced in the hundreds of thousands, becoming ubiquitous on every front. German soldiers, who were still reliant on millions of horses to pull their supplies and artillery, were stunned by the sheer number of these small, go-anywhere vehicles. Every American officer, every medic, every mechanic seemed to have his own jeep. It represented a level of tactical mobility that the Wehrmacht, for all its early war times, blitzkrieg times prowess, could no longer hope to match. The ultimate expression of this industrial philosophy was Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, a facility so vast it had its own airfield. It was designed to build B-24 Liberator bombers using the same assembly line techniques Henry Ford had perfected for the Model T. After a difficult start, the plant hit its stride, and at its peak in 1944, it was producing one 4-engine heavy bomber every 63 minutes. German intelligence reports on Willow Run were dismissed by the Luftwaffe High Command as absurd American propaganda. Hermann Göring himself famously declared it impossible. They couldn't believe it because their own system, which took weeks to hand-build a single bomber, was incapable of thinking on such a scale. The American approach was not to build the times best times possible weapon in small numbers. It was to build a times very good times weapon in numbers so vast that quality became irrelevant. The German Tiger tank was a masterpiece of engineering, with powerful armor and a deadly 88mm gun. It was also a maintenance nightmare, and only 1,347 were ever built. The American M4 Sherman tank was on a 1-to-1 basis, inferior, but the Americans built over 50,000 of them. German panzer crews, with a growing sense of dread, developed a grim joke. The only thing worse than seeing a Sherman tank is seeing the 5 that are right behind it. This disparity extended to the most basic resources of modern warfare. The German war machine was chronically starved of fuel. Despite conquering vast territories, they had failed to secure major oil fields, and were dependent on a handful of synthetic fuel plants in Romania and Germany. These plants became the top priority for Allied bombers, and by late 1944, the Luftwaffe was virtually grounded, and panzer divisions were often unable to maneuver simply because their tanks were empty. The American war effort, in contrast, floated on a literal ocean of oil. The United States was the world's largest oil producer, and its tankers crisscrossed the globe with impunity. They even constructed a secret pipeline under the English Channel, codenamed Pluto, Pipeline Under the Ocean, to ensure a continuous supply of fuel for the invasion of Europe. The most common object on any Allied-held road was not a weapon, but the 5-gallon jerrycan. Millions upon millions of them were produced and shipped, each one a building block of Allied victory. A German tank commander, sitting immobilized in his technologically superior Tiger, waiting for a meager fuel ration to arrive by horse cart, could only watch as endless convoys of American trucks, each one laden with jerrycans, roared past on their way to the front. It was a maddening, soul-destroying spectacle. The German soldier was fighting for time's Lebensraum asterisk, or living space, a core Nazi concept that Germany needed to conquer the fertile lands of Eastern Europe to feed its people. It was a war for bread. The supreme, crushing irony was that they were fighting against a nation that was the undisputed breadbasket of the world. American agriculture, like its industry, had become a hyper-efficient machine. While German farmers still used horses, American farmers were using fleets of gasoline-powered tractors. The result was a food surplus so enormous that the United States could feed its entire army, maintain a high standard of living for its civilians, and, through the Lend-Lease program, ship millions of tons of food to its allies, including Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Much of the food that kept the Red Army fighting on the Eastern Front was American-made Spam, American flour, and American sugar, shipped across treacherous seas at enormous cost. The German soldier, gnawing on his stale times Kommissbrot asterisk, was fighting a multi-front war against a coalition that was being fed, fueled, and armed by a single, untouchable industrial superpower located thousands of miles away. It was an equation that could only lead to one outcome. Confronted by this evidence day after day, the German soldier's fighting spirit began to collapse under the sheer weight of American production. He was no longer a warrior in a noble cause. He was a man trying to stop a flood with a shovel. He was experiencing the psychological phenomenon of the times material Schlacht asterisk, the battle of material. It was a term born in the trenches of World War I, but it was perfected in World War II. It was the feeling of being an insignificant insect facing an impersonal, unstoppable, industrial grinding machine. Every German plane shot down was a tragic loss of a skilled pilot and a complex machine. Every American plane lost was a mere statistic, replaced from an endless inventory the next day. This realization bred a profound and fatalistic despair. Why fight? Why die? For what purpose when the enemy's power was so obviously infinite? In the final months, the will of the Wehrmacht did not break, it simply dissolved. The final surrender was merely a formality, an acknowledgement of a conclusion that had been written in the production figures of Detroit, in the oil fields of Texas, and on the wrapper of a K-Ration chocolate bar for years. The final surrender in May 1945 was not just a military capitulation, it was the death of a worldview. The German people, who had been promised a 1,000-year empire, were left in a literal and spiritual wasteland. Their cities were unrecognizable landscapes of rubble, their government had evaporated, and their armies were now a shuffling grey mass of millions of disarmed prisoners. In this void, the German people, both soldiers and civilians, experienced the final, and perhaps most profound, shock of the war. They discovered that their survival now depended entirely on the mercy and the logistical power of the very enemy they had been taught to despise. The Americans they had fought with such ferocity were now the arbiters of their fate, and what stunned them was not cruelty or revenge, but a continuation of the same overwhelming, systematic abundance that had defeated them on the battlefield. The initial fear of the occupying American forces quickly gave way to disbelief. GIS, now tasked with managing vast columns of prisoners and a starving civilian population, did what the American system was designed to do. They organized. They set up food distribution points, drawing from the very same logistical chain that had supplied the invasion. The K-Ration, the C-Ration, and the 1-0-in-1 ration, once the exclusive meal of the Allied soldier, now became the sustenance for the defeated Reich. For a German family that had been surviving on boiled nettles and hoarded potatoes, the gift of a can of American processed ham or a box of crackers was a miracle. It was an experience repeated millions of times across the shattered country. The encounter with the American soldier was not an encounter with a vengeful conqueror, but with a friendly, often boyish young man who seemed to have an infinite supply of chewing gum, cigarettes, and food. They couldn't believe the kindness. They had been indoctrinated for a decade to see Americans as racially impure gangsters and capitalists, the antithesis of their Aryan ideals. Instead, they met young men who shared their rations with hungry children and seemed more interested in fraternizing with local girls than in exerting their authority. This was not a conquest, it was a cultural invasion of a type they were utterly unprepared for. The legacy of the K-Ration transformed into the care package. These were boxes of surplus army rations, initially and later specially packaged goods, sent from private American citizens to the people of Europe. For a German housewife, opening a care package was like rediscovering a lost civilization. Inside was everything her family had been deprived of for years: tins of lard, bags of sugar, real coffee beans, powdered milk, and of course, chocolate. Each item was a potent symbol of the world that had existed beyond their sealed-off fortress of Nazi ideology. Each spoonful of sugar was a refutation of Goebbels's propaganda. This wasn't a government program. This was the casual generosity of individual citizens of the victor nation. The Germans were shocked. It demonstrated a depth of national wealth and a spirit of individual charity that their own collectivist, state-worshipping system could never have produced. The contents of these packages became more than sustenance. They became a form of currency in the black markets of post-war Germany. A single pack of American cigarettes could be traded for valuable heirlooms. A bar of chocolate could buy a week's worth of labor. The iconic brands Lucky Strike, Hershey's, Maxwell House became the symbols of the new era. They were aspirational. To possess an American consumer good was to possess a small piece of the future, a token of the prosperous, democratic world that was replacing the nightmare they had just survived. They never knew that their conquerors would feed them, clothe them, and then rebuild their country. In the years that followed, as the rubble was cleared and the Marshall Plan began to pour billions of American dollars into the reconstruction of Western Europe, The leaders of the fallen Reich reflected on their defeat from their prison cells. Their conclusions, recorded during interrogations and in their memoirs, were strikingly similar. They did not blame their soldiers or their generals. They blamed their own profound, arrogant, and ultimately fatal ignorance. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and the architect of the German war economy, stated it most clearly. He admitted that while he was busy trying to squeeze a few more tanks out of Germany's rigid bureaucratic system, the Americans were carrying out a veritable miracle of production, a miracle which the enemy had not thought possible. He confessed that he never understood the flexible, decentralized power of American capitalism until he saw the production statistics after the war. He was stunned. Captured German generals, one after another, told the same story. They had planned for a traditional European war of maneuver and tactics. They were prepared to fight soldiers. They were not prepared to fight an assembly line. They were not prepared for an enemy who viewed logistics not as a secondary concern, but as the very center of gravity in modern warfare. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander of German forces in the West on D-Day, gave a famously succinct assessment when asked what he thought was the decisive reason for Germany's defeat: the American motor. It was a simple answer that encompassed everything: the trucks, the tanks, the planes, the jeeps, and the industrial heartland that produced them all. And so, the story that began with a German soldier's laughter in 1943 ends with the quiet, reflective awe of his commanders in defeat. They laughed at the flying milk bottles until those P-47 Thunderbolts owned the skies. They mocked the M4 Sherman as a Tommy cooker until they were being swarmed by an unstoppable tide of them, and they dismissed the American G.I. Leng as a soft, pampered amateur until they found themselves staring into the bottom of a K-Ration box, confronted by the soul-crushing evidence of a power they could never hope to match. The P-47 Thunderbolt might have broken the Luftwaffe, and the Sherman tank may have broken the Panzer divisions, but it was the humble K-Ration that broke the German spirit. It was the simplest, most intimate, and most undeniable proof that they were on the wrong side of history. It was the ambassador of a nation that had turned mass production into an art form and abundance into a weapon. That small cardboard box, born in a physiologist's lab and filled by the hands of American factory workers, did more than just feed a soldier. It carried the full, unanswerable weight of the American century into every foxhole and trench in Europe. It was a promise, a threat, and a prophecy of the world that was to come. A world where the roar of the assembly line would be more decisive than the roar of any cannon. The German soldier in the Hürtgen Forest wept when he tasted that chocolate, not just for his own hunger, but for the future he now knew he would never have. The war was over for him in that moment. The thunder had spoken, not from the sky, but from a simple wax-coated box, and its message was absolute.